Welcome back to a new section of this course about how to use databases in PHP code. So in the last couple of episodes, we talked about how we can insert and manipulate data inside a database. And in this episode, I want to focus on how we could access our database directly from our website. So let's create a new folder and call it projects or project. And inside our project folder, let's create an index.php. And let's create HTML markup by writing down doc, hit tab. Let's save it and refresh the browser. And let's open our folder project. What we do not want to do with our connection is to put it right inside of our index.php, so inside of our body tags. But we want to create a new file that stores our database connection. So let's create a new folder and call it includes inside our project folder, of course. And inside our includes folder, let's create a new file and let's name it database.php. Let's create opening and closing PHP tags. If you're only going to use PHP code inside a file, it's not necessary to add a closing PHP tag, but for the sake of this video, I will do it. So in order to connect to a database, we need 4 params. So let's create a new variable, and let's call it dbHost. Set it equal to double quotes and a semicolon. So let's copy paste it 4 times. And let's change the name of the second one to dbUser. We also need a dbPass, and we need a dbName. Now we need to fill in the values. So inside the double quotes of our dbHost, we need to write down the host name. And since we are using a localhost server, the name is localhost. But you actually need to be aware that if you are using a web server to upload documents, you actually need to change it to whatever your host is. So let me add a comment. Let's say params to connect to a database. Now let me zoom in. All right. So inside the double quotes of dbUser, we need to write down the username. And since we are using XAMPP, the default username is root. The password needs to be empty because we don't have a password. The default password in XAMPP is empty. So if you actually have created a password somewhere, you need to fill it in right here. But I will keep it empty because, well, I don't have a password. And if you are using an online server as well, you need to add a password, otherwise it won't work. In the variable dbName, the value needs to be the name of the database that we created. And if you remember, I called mine PHP tutorial. And if you used another name, you need to use the name that you gave to your database because, well, PHP tutorial won't work for you, of course. So now that we have created our params, we need to create our database connection. So let's create a variable called con of connection and set it equal to a PHP function called mysqli underscore connect. And you probably might wonder what the I is after MySQL, and the I stands for improved. Well, if I remove it, you can see that the color is still green, and they accomplish the same thing. But MySQL supports some things that the old MySQL does not. So things like prepared statement, multiple statements, or transactions. And I know that you haven't heard of these before, but you will later on. So I always recommend you to use MySQL because it's simply an improved version. So let me add a comment, connection to database. So inside the parentheses, we need 4 params. And, well, we actually create the 4. So let's copy paste them inside the parentheses and separate them with a colon. We also need. Keep in mind that this is the order that you need to write them inside your connection. And well, it's the same order that we created our params. So let's go to our index.php, and at the top of our page, let's create PHP opening and closing tags, and let's require once the folder includes, database.php. And that's ended with a semicolon. So right now, in our body tag, we have access to the variable con, which is the connection of our database. And whenever we need to connect to the database, we just need to refer to the variable con. Well, let's actually go back to the database.php, and right below my connection, I want to create an if statement because, well, I want to see if the connection actually exists. So let's say that if variable con, and if it's true, we don't want to do anything. But else, so if there's not a connection, I want to use a function called die. And let's add some text. Let's say database connection failed. And later on, you will see why this is important to do, because we won't get an error message right now, but whenever we are not connected, you can see that the database connection failed message will be printed out on the screen. So with the variable con that we created, we can go inside our database and write down the data inside our web page. So let's go to our index.php and let's remove variable con. Let's create opening and closing PHP tags. And let's start creating our connection. So the first thing that I want to do is that I want to select all the data using an SQL statement. So let's create a new variable called SQL and set it equal, well, to double quotes and a semicolon. By now, you must know what a select query is. So let's write it down. Inside our double quotes, let's say that we want to select star, so everything, from the table's users that we created in the introduction to database sections. Now that we have the SQL query that we want, we need to get inside of our database to perform the query. This is also called querying. And the way you do this is, well, let's go one line below. And let's create a new variable called result. And let's set it equal to a mysqli function. So mysqli underscore query. And the mysql query takes two params. So the first one is the connection. And in our case, it's con, because we can actually access it. And the second one is the query that you actually want to perform. And in our case, it's variable SQL. Now, what will happen is that the results will be fetched. And what we want to do is to print it out on our website. Before we actually want to print something out, I want to do a check if we are actually getting something back. And if we do not, we want something to be printed out. So let's go one line below. Let's create a new variable called row count and set it equal to mysqli underscore num underscore rows. And this function returns the number of rows in a result set. And it takes one param, and that's what we actually want to check. And in our case, we want to check variable result. So let's go one line below. And right here, we want to create an if statement. And we want to check if we have more than one line, because if that is true, the database is returning something, and that's actually what we want. So in our if statement, the condition needs to be that if row count is greater than 0, do something. So let's go inside our if loop. Well, we're selecting everything right now with a star sign. So we need to create a while loop inside our if statement that keeps printing everything out as long as it's getting back results. But before we continue on, let's create an else statement and let's echo out no results found. So let's go right back inside of our condition of the while loop. And we need to create a new variable called row. And let's set it equal to a new function called mysqli underscore fetch underscore assoc. And what this function does is it returns an associative array that corresponds to the fetched row until there are no more rows left. So it takes one param because, well, we're not fetching anything right now. And that's the variable result because that's what we actually want to fetch. So let's go inside our while loop. This might be a little bit too much for now because, well, you're learning all these new functions. So let me explain to you what we're doing. So we created a query, select all from users, and we called it SQL. Then we created a new query called results that will check if the query can be performed in the database. We created a new variable called row count, and that will count the rows that we're getting back from variable result, as you can see in the param. So if the amount of row count is higher than 0, what we're doing in our if statements, then we want to loop through the data and print everything out as an associative array. And since it's an array, we need to echo it out like an array. So let's do that. So let's say echo variable row, because we're setting it equal to the fetched results, brackets, semicolon. So inside our brackets, we need to specify the column that we want to print. So remember, we had an ID, a username, and a password. So let's say that we want to echo out username. Well, let's also add a break. Let's save it. Let's refresh the browser. And you can see all the names that we have in our database on our screen. And let me show you my local host real quick, because, well, you must have the same information on your screen. Let me zoom out. Let's enter PHP tutorial, table users. And you can see that we have Dari 06, 08, 10, Jack, David, Michael, and John. And if I close it, you can see that the same names are printed out on my screen. And you can even echo out the password. So let's echo out username, punctuation mark, row, brackets, and we want the password. So let's save it, refresh it, and you can see that all the passwords are printed out. But that's not what we want right now. The problem right now is that, well, we're selecting everything. But what we can do is to go after users and create a condition. And let's say that we want to select everything from users where the ID is equal to 1. Save it, refresh the browser, and the output is Dari 06. And remember that we deleted ID number 2, so let's try to print it out. And we have no results. And this is why I like the else statement, because, well, if I remove it, save it, refresh it, nothing's happening. So you don't know what the problem actually is. Since we have our query in our index.php right now, let's go back to the database and let's write a typo in our DB name. Save it, refresh the browser, and you can see that, well, database connection failed. So you know what the problem is right here, because we made a typo right here. What our goal eventually is to check if the data from the database is equal to the input fields of the login form. So in order to do this, we actually need to create a login form. And before we do that, I want to separate my index.php, because we will actually need the header and footer on our login and register form. So in our includes, let's create a new file, and let's name it header.php. Let's create another one, and let's call it footer.php. And let's put some stuff inside our header.php. First off, we want everything until our opening body tag. We also need our require once database, because we need it on every single page. So let's remove it from our index page, and let's paste it in our header. And let's do the same thing for our footer. We need our closing body tag and HTML tag. So let's copy it, paste it in our footer, and in between our body and HTML tag, let's create a footer opening and closing tag. So let's save it, close it. We don't need our header right now, so let's save it as well and close it. Let's focus on our index.php. Right now, we don't need our code right here. So let's remove it, and let's require once. Inside our folder includes, and we want our header.php. Copy paste it, and let's replace it with footer. In between our PHP tags, let's write home. Save it, refresh the browser, and you can see our home page. So in our projects folder, let's create a new file and let's call it style.css because we want to style some stuff. And let's open our header.php because below our title, we need to create a link. So let's type down link. The rel is equal to style sheet. The type is equal to text//CSS. And the href is equal to style.css. And inside our header.php, let's create our navigation. So below our body text, let's write down header, hit tab. Let's create a nav. So our navigation, we need an unordered list. And inside our unordered list, we need list items. And every list item has a link. So let's create a href and a closing href tag. So the href of our first page is index.php. And in between our tags, let's write down home. Let me zoom out. Yes. So let's copy paste it 2 more times. Let's change the second one to login and the last one to register. And the links as well. So login, register. We don't have these right now, but we will create them in a second. So let's do the same thing for our footer real quick. So let's go to footer. And in between our footer, opening and closing tag, let's create a paragraph tag. And let's say, this is my footer of the login and register form. Save it, close it, because we don't need it anymore. So right now, we need to style everything. And I won't be explaining what all the styling means, but I want to work with a good looking form. So let's go to our style sheet and let's style our HTML first. So let's say that the width is 100%, the height is also 100%, and the font family is equal to Helvetica, Arial, sans serif. Now we need to style our body. So the padding is 0 and the margin is 0 as well. Now we need to style our header. The height is equal to 60 pixels. The background color, right now it's white, but I want it to be less white. So F2, F2, F2. And it has a box shadow, box shadow of 0, 0, 10 pixels, and the color is 0, 0, 0. So save it, refresh it, and let me zoom out a little bit. This looks a little bit better. So let's continue on. Now we need to style our unordered list, which we want to float to the right. The position is relative, and we want it to be 10% from the right. Save it, refresh it, and this is what we want. Well, not yet though. So right now we want to style our list items. So we want the elements to be inlined, and we want the list style to be none. This looks better. So we also need to style the links because right now they are blue and I don't like that. So let's say that the text decoration is none. The color is black. The font size is 18 pixels. And the padding is 0 top, 0 right, 0 bottom, and 20 pixels to the left. Save it, refresh it, and this looks way better. We also need to style our footer real quick because, well, it's right now at the top of our screen, but we want it to be at the bottom. So footer, and the position needs to be absolute, otherwise it can't be at the bottom. So the bottom is 0%, the width is 100%, the height is 60 as well, pixels. The background color is F2, F2, F2. The box shadow is also the same, 0, 0, 10 pixels, black. And the text align needs to be in the center, and the margin is 0 auto, otherwise the text align won't work. Save it, and this is what I actually want. Well, let's style the paragraph as well, and let's say text transform uppercase. Alright. Now that we have styled our header and footer, we need to create our login page. So let's close off style.css. Inside projects, let's create a new file and let's name it login.php. So we actually can copy our index and let's paste it right here. And instead of home, let's create h1 tags and say login. Let's create a paragraph tag and let's say no account. Let's create a link and say register.php. And the text needs to be register here. And we need to close our href. Save it. Well, let's go to login.php. Alright. Now we need to create a form. And we will keep the action empty right now because we will fill it in whenever we are at the point that we want to create our backend code. The method is equal to post. And we need two input fields. The first one is type is equal to text. The name is username. And the placeholder is equal to username. Let's copy it and paste it. And the second one, the type is equal to password. The name is equal to password as well. And the placeholder is password with capital P. We need to create a button because it needs to be submitted. And the type is equal to submit. And in between our button text, let's write down login. Save it, refresh it, and we need to style it. This isn't that much, so let's open our style.css. I even said that we don't need it. Excuse me. So let's style the h1. And let's say text transform uppercase. Font size is 48 pixels. Now we need to style our paragraph link. So the register here. Let's say color 666. We actually forgot to put it inside div tags. Excuse me. Alright. Because we want to style it. Well, we want to text align it in the center. So the width is 100%, margin is 0 auto, and text align is in the center. This looks better. Now we need to style our input field, and the display is block, because we want them to be beneath each other. The margin is 20 pixels auto, text align center, box shadow 0, 0, 10 pixels, 666. The width is 240 pixels. The height is 30 pixels. And the background color is F2, F2, F2. Now we need to style the button and then we're done styling. The width is 240. Height is 60. Background color is black. So 0, 0, 0, 0. And the color is FFFFFF. Save it, refresh it, and this is what we're looking for. So what we need to do next is to create our register form. So let's save it and close it. Well, let's copy our login. Let's close it. Let's create a new file in project and let's name it register.php. Paste it in here. Let's replace login to register. And let's change no account to already have an account. Login. And let's change the link to login. And let's copy the input because we need to have a confirm. Well, the name needs to be confirm password. Register needs to be in between the button tags. And well, let's change login in our URL to register. And let's change the placeholder as well to confirm password. Yes, this is what we want. So now that we have created our markup, we can focus on the functionality of the form. So inside our includes folder, let's create a new file and let's call it register-inc.php. I added a dash because we already have a UI with the name register, so I don't want to confuse you. So the register-inc.php will be the place where we are going to create our script. So what we need to do now is to go to our register.php, and we need to set the action to includes /register-inc.php. So whenever the submit button is clicked, we will refer to the register-inc.php page, where we will be doing some error handlers and see if there are any problems in the form. So let's go to our register.inc and let's create opening and closing PHP tags. And let me zoom in a little bit. And like I said in the previous episodes, you do not need to have a closing PHP tag, because on this page we're only going to focus on PHP code. And you only need a closing PHP tag whenever you're working inside HTML code. But since I've actually done this in the last couple of episodes, I will do it here as well. So the first thing that we're going to do is to check if a user has clicked the button, since it's possible for users to access the page without clicking the button. So if you go to my URL and remove register.php, and after the backslash we're writing includes /register-inc.php, we got redirected to the backend of this page, and that's, well, not what we want. So therefore we actually need to do some checks before we continue on. And before we continue on, well, let's go back to the register page. And in our PHP tags, let's create an if statement to see if the user have clicked the button with the isSet function. And since our method in our register.php is equal to post, we want to check for the post method with a $_post, set of brackets, and in single quotes we want to check for submit, because the type of the button is submit, and we actually need to set the name equal to submit as well. I think I actually forgot this in the last episode. So now that we have added this, we know that the user came here the legit way, and by not changing the URL. Let me zoom out a little bit because I think it's a little bit too much. So what we need to do now is to call our connection from the database. And before we continue on, let me give you a reminder. In our includes folder we have database.php, so let's click on it. And I'm actually seeing something that I could do better. So let's copy the die function, and let's add an exclamation mark right in front of variable con, because true becomes false now, and we can place our die function right inside the if, and we can remove the else. This looks way better because it's not good to have an if statement without anything inside of it. So let's save it. Let's go back to our register. And whenever the button is clicked, we want to require our database connection. So let me add a comment, add database connection. And let's say require, single quotes, semicolon, database.php. And since we are already inside the includes folder, we do not need to use it in front of database.php. So right now, we have access to variable con. And what we want to do now is to fetch the information from the form when a user registers on the website. And in order to do that, we actually need to do the same thing as we did in the condition of the if statement. So the post method. And with the post method, we want to grab information from the form. So let's create a variable called username, because, well, the first input field is username. And let's set it equal to the post method. So $_post, brackets, and inside the brackets, we want to grab the username, because in our register form, you can see that the name is equal to username. So we're grabbing that username. And let's end it with a semicolon. And the same thing needs to be done for the password and confirm password. So let's copy paste it 2 more times. Change the second variable to password. And the name is equal to password, and the confirm password is confirm password. So let's change it. Password, and the last one is confirm password, and the variable name is confirm pass. So what we're doing right here is taking the information that's inputted in input field username, password, and confirm password, and we're setting it equal to a variable called username, password, and confirm password. Before we continue on right now, we need to do some error handlers to see if the user has made mistakes, because a username can only be created once and we don't want to have two usernames in our database. So therefore, we want to give an error message whenever the username already exists. I will be including the most basic error handlers that I could think of. There are so many error handlers that you actually could do, but I looked around on a couple of websites and just took the basic ones. And if you remember, in our database, we said that our columns cannot be empty. So let me show that to you. So let's go to localhost /phpMyAdmin. That went wrong. Let's click on PHP tutorials, table users, and let's click on structure. And you can see that the values of ID, username, and password cannot be null. So let's go back to our register form. And the first check that I want to do is to check if all the fields are filled in. So right below our variables, let's create an if statement. And the condition is a function called empty, because we want to check if a variable is empty or not. And it would return true if a variable is empty and false if it's not empty. So what we first want to check is variable username. And we actually could create 3 if statements, but right here, I want to use a logical operator. So right after our first function, so in between the closing parentheses, let's write down 2 vertical bars, and let's copy our function, paste it after the vertical bars, and change the variable to password. And let's do the same thing for our confirm password. And be careful when you're copy pasting stuff, because you can make easily mistakes with parentheses or semicolons, because we are creating a function which has parentheses inside our if statement that also has parentheses. And I'm just saying this because it's, well, even for me, a very common mistake to make a typo with parentheses or semicolons. So be aware that if you're getting one, the problem is with parentheses or semicolon, and the code is not the problem. So if a field is empty, we want to redirect the user to the same form with an error message. So inside our if statement, let's use a function that we already have used before called header, and set the location, well, in double quotes, location, colon, to punctuation mark /register.php. And if you don't know what the punctuation mark / means, this is basically going back one directory, because right now we're in our includes folder, but our register.php is right inside of our project folder. So we're taking a step back from includes and we're going to project. And after register.php, let's add a question mark and say that error is equal to empty fields. We also want to send back some information because, well, some programmers do not care that the user has to re-enter all his fields again. But from a user experience perspective, you don't want the user to fill in all the fields again. And especially when you're dealing with a website that is generating money for you. So I recommend you to do this, because otherwise the user has to fill in all his fields again, and chances are that it will probably go to another website. And the way you do this is by setting the name of the input field equal to the variable. So after empty fields, let's write down an ampersand and say that username is equal, and let's concatenate the variable username. And, well, because the password is sensitive information, we don't want to send back the password in the URL. So right now, let's test it out. But before we do that, we need to include this page inside our header.php. So let's do that. Let's go to our header.php. And let's copy paste our require ones from the database and change database to register-inc. So let's save it. Well, let's save all the pages. So let's fill in a username and let's say Dari. Let's add a password of 12345, and let's not add a confirm password. And let's make the screen bigger. Now let's click on register. And you can see that we're getting an error message in the URL because we have an empty field and the username is equal to Dari. And that's what we want. But if we go back, we need to add something else inside our if statement. We want to add a new function below our header function called exit. Because we basically want to jump out of the code because we don't want anything after the if statement to be executed. So let's create an else if statement. And it really doesn't matter if you have a space between else if. PHP will understand that, well, with or without space, you're dealing with an else if statement. So the condition of the else if statement will be a new function called preg_match. But we want to add an exclamation mark right in front of it because we want to see if it is false. And what preg_match basically does is it searches in a string for a pattern and it will return true if it exists and false if it isn't. And preg_match takes two params. The first one is the search pattern and the second one is where you want to search in. So let's say first and second. And the search pattern that I'm using for a username is a very common one that you can find everywhere on the internet. So inside our first set of double quotes, we need to write down a /, a caret, so an arrow up, and a set of brackets. And inside the brackets, we want to say what we want to allow. And we want to allow letters A-Z, so A until Z. And we also want to allow them in uppercase. And we want to allow the numbers 0 through 9. So let's go outside of our brackets, write down a star and a /. And the second param is what we actually want to check. So what we want to check, well, we don't need double quotes. We want to check for username because we don't want to have any weird signs inside of our username. And whenever a user has an invalid username, we want to do, well, basically the same as in the if statement, so the header and exit function. But instead of saying you have empty fields, we want to say invalid username. And we want to send back the username. So let's go outside of our else if and let's create a new one. And what we want to do right here is to check if the password do not match the confirm password. So let's write down variable password and let's say exclamation mark equal to confirm pass. So if we just say equal, we want to see if they are equal. But we want to give an error message only if they are not equal. So let's go back and let's copy the same message from above. So the header and exit. Let me make my screen a little bit bigger. Now let's change the error message, so invalid username, to password do not match. So passwords, I made a mistake. Passwords do not match. And we actually want to send back the username because the username is valid. And the last check that we want to do is to see if a username already exists inside of our database. So let's create an else statement. And inside the else statement, we need to create a connection to the database to see if a username already exists. So let's create variable SQL. Let's set it equal to double quotes. So like we did in the first episode of this section, let's create a variable in our else statement. Let's create a variable called SQL and set it equal to double quotes and a semicolon. Inside the double quotes, we want to create a query. So what we want to do is to select username from the table users, where username is equal to, and right now, I actually want to show you how prepared statements work. The way you learn it in a lot of other videos is just by copy-pasting the variable username and pasting it right after it, just like this. And what I want to learn you from the beginning is the right way, and that's using prepared statements. And what a prepared statement is a SQL query template containing placeholders instead of the actual param. And we will replace these placeholders with the actual values. Using prepared statements has a lot of advantages because it can be executed repeatedly with high efficiency, because the statement is parsed only once. And well, what I think is the biggest advantage is that it provides strong protection against SQL injection, because parameter values are not embedded directly inside the SQL query. So what we are doing right now, it is because, well, it's directly in the query, but they will be sent to the database separately. The reason why it's important to use prepared statements is, well, let's go back to our page. A hacker can easily go in our input field, let's say username, and say something like drop database, which is not the exact query to drop a database, but there is one. The query will be performed inside our database and it will drop our database. And using a prepared statement is simply by removing the variable username with a question mark. You do not need to put the question mark inside single quotes like this, because SQL will see this as a string, so it will actually put a question mark inside our database. So let's remove them. So let's go one line below. And we want to create a new variable called stmt, which stands for statement. And we want to set it equal to a function called mysqli underscore stmt underscore init, which stands for initialize. And this function initializes a statement and returns an object to use with mysqli underscore statement underscore prepare, which we'll be using in a second. So mysqli statement init takes one param, and that's our database connection. So $con. So let's go one line below. And we want to create an if statement, because the way I like to work is to always check for errors first before we continue on. So what I want to check inside the condition is if, so question mark, the variable that I just said, mysqli underscore stmt underscore prepare failed. So therefore we're adding a question mark. And this takes two params, and that's stmt, so the statement, and the actual query. And in our case, it's SQL, it's the first one. So if it failed, so the SQL query and the statement cannot be matched, we want to copy paste one error, so the header. So let's copy it, paste it. So we don't even need the username to be passed. And we want to set the error equal to SQL error. But if it didn't fail, we want to continue our script. So let's create an else statement. And inside the else statement, we want to take the information that the user gave us, so the variables at the top, and we want to put it inside the database and run it with an SQL variable. So inside the else statement, let's use a new function called mysqli underscore stmt underscore bind underscore param. So what we're going to do is to bind, and what we actually want to bind is the statement. So that's the first param, stmt, and there's another one, so comma, and this is the data type that we're going to pass in. So you need to write down in double quotes the letter S, which stands for a string. So SQL knows that, hey, we're passing a string to the database, and then I stands for integer and a B stands for Boolean. So right now we want to pass in only the username, so we're using one S. But let's say that we want to check an username and email. So you only need to add an extra S inside the double quotes. You don't need to put it in a new set of double quotes because that won't work. So let's remove it and let's continue on. There's another param, which is the third one, and this is the variable that the user has passed inside the input fields. So in our case, it's comma, variable, username. So what we want to do after we binded the param is to call a new function called mysqli underscore statement underscore execute. And this takes one param, And that's the statement that we want to execute. And in our case, it's $stmt. So what we're doing right now is focusing on our prepared statement, but we actually need to check if there is a match and the user already exists, or the username already exists. And the way you do that is by using a function called mysqli underscore stmt underscore store underscore result. And what this does is it takes the result that we got from the database and it stores it back in the variable stmt. So what we need to do now is to see how many results we're getting back. So let's create a new variable on the line below called row count. Set it equal to mysqli underscore stmt underscore num underscore rows. And this will check how many rows we're getting back from the database. We're getting rows back from the database because we want the ID, the username, and password. And what we actually want to count is the statement. So let's copy it. Well, let's write it down, stmt. So now variable row count will be equal to the amount of rows we're getting back from the database. And this should be 0 or 1. Because if the username already exists, we're getting 1 row back from the database, and which can be possible. And if we're getting 0 back, we know that the username doesn't exist and we can continue on. So now that we actually got this, we can go, well, 2 lines below and create an if statement. And inside the condition, we can check if row count is greater than 0. And like I said, if it's greater than 0, that means that we already have a user with the username. So what we want to do next is to redirect the user to the register page and an error message. So let's copy our header and exit again. Let's paste it inside the if statement. Now let's change the error to username taken. This was pretty much the last check that we did, because what we need to do right now is to sign up a user to a website. So let's create an else statement after the if statement of the row count. And inside the else statement, we're going to do something we actually did before. We're going to run a query. So let's copy the SQL query and paste it inside the else statement. But instead of selecting, well, let's remove everything inside of it. But instead of selecting, we actually want to insert something in the database. And we're going to do this with prepared statements as well. So let's write down insert into users, parentheses, values, another set of parentheses. And since we already have an auto increment on our ID, we do not need to add an ID inside the insert, but we only need to add a username and password. So let me show you our database real quick. Let's go to PHP tutorials, users, and you can see that we have an ID, which is auto increment. We have a username and password. So inside the first set of parentheses, let's write down username, comma, password. And inside the values, we want to insert placeholders, because remember, we're working with prepared statements. So let's write down question mark, comma, question mark. Let's go 1 line below. Well, we can actually copy our statement as well, paste it right inside of the else statement, because we want to run a new statement. And we actually want to run the if statement as well. So let's paste it inside of it again. Well, don't forget to add your closing bracket right here, because I didn't copy it. What we're doing right here is checking if the SQL statement matches. So we're doing that in the if statement. Else, so we need to create an else statement. We want to continue on. And what we basically want to do right here is 3 mysqli functions. And hey, we actually got them. So let's copy them, the bind, the execute, and the result. And we actually forgot to do something, because we want to store the statement. And inside the other one as well, so we want to store the statement. However, when we inserted the data in our first query, we only checked the username. So what we want to insert is the username and password. In the bind param function, we need to add another s, and after the variable username, we want to add a comma and variable password. And please do remember that bind param needs to be in the same order as your query, because if we replace username with password and password with username, our username will be stored in the password column, and that's not what we want. So thank you for watching this episode. In the next episode, I want to focus on hashing passwords. So thank you for watching this episode, and I'll be seeing you in the next one. We don't want to enter the password of a user inside the database without hashing it. Whatever the user has put inside the input field will be visible in the database. And once again, if a hacker gets access to your database, he can get right to the usernames and passwords. And when you're dealing with a website that has credit card information or whatever sensitive information attached to it, that person will be in a lot of trouble. And the way you prevent this is by hashing passwords. And what you will basically do with hashing passwords is creating a new encrypted password of 60 characters using a strong one-way hashing algorithm. So whenever a user tries to log in, we're taking the hashed password and we're going to rehash it to the original password. Then we will perform a check if it matches, and if it does, we're going to grant access to the user. So in our bind param in our else statement, we do not want to pass in password right now. We want to remove it, and before we bind it, so one line above, we're going to hash the password. So let's create a new variable called hashed pass and set it equal to password underscore hash parentheses. And inside the parentheses, we need to pass in two params. The first one is the original password, so that's variable password, comma, and the second param is the way you want to hash the password. And in our case, we're going to use bcrypt. And the reason why I prefer bcrypt and the reason why I actually prefer bcrypt is that it will always be updated. And whenever there is a security breach, they will be updating it and solving the problem. A common hashing method on the internet is MD5 or MD7, but I'm strongly against using it because it's outdated and not safe anymore. And the method we want to use, so after the comma, is in capitals, password, underscore, default. What we need to do now is go right after username, write a comma, and we want to pass in the hashed pass. We actually do not need the store result statement in our else statement, because that's only if you want to fetch information from the database. And right now, we want to insert data in the database. So let's remove it. So what will happen right now is that the user will be inserted in the database, but we actually want to send the user back to the sign up page with a success message. So let's copy the header and exit. Let's paste it. And let's change error to success. And the value is registered. Before we go to test this, I want to do one more thing. And that's to close the statement, and we need to close the database connection. It's not necessary to do this, because MySQLi will automatically do this. We want to save some resources and do it ourselves. So I already looked this up. Let's go to the second to last curly bracket. Let's hit enter. And we need to return a MySQLi underscore stmt underscore close. And this takes one param, and that's the MySQLi statement that we created. And in our case, that's variable stmt. And what we're basically doing right now is, well, we're closing off the statement. We also need to close the connection. And on the line below, we need to create a MySQLi underscore close, and we want to pass in variable con. So let's save it. Let's go back to the browser, refresh the browser. Let's enter a username. So let's say Dari100. My password is 12345. And the confirm password is 12345. So let's click on register. And you can see that success is equal to registered. So what we need to do now is to go to our phpMyAdmin. Let's refresh table users. And you can see that Dari100 with ID number 15 and the hashed password is registered in our database. So right in our includes folder, let's create a new file and let's name it login-inc.php. The login script that we will be creating is pretty similar to the register script. So if we go to our register.inc, you can see that we're doing a check if the user actually clicked the submit button in order to access this page. And well, this needs to be done in our login script as well. So let's go to our login-inc and let's create opening and closing PHP tags. And in our opening and closing PHP tags, let's create an if statement where we want to use the function isSet if the post method, so $_post, is clicked with the name submit. I can actually copy paste it from the register page, but for the sake of this video, I won't be doing that because I want to go through it one more time. Right now, we're checking if the user has clicked the submit button. But we want to do something if a user tries to access this page without clicking on the button. So let's create an else statement. Let's go to our register.inc and we need to copy a header and exit. Let's paste it in our else. And let's change the error to access forbidden. So whenever a user is trying to access this page, it will be redirected to the home page. So let's change that as well to the index page with an error which says access forbidden. Just like the register-inc, we need to create the connection to the database. So in our if statement, let's require in single quotes database.php semicolon. And what we want to do now is to grab the information from the input fields and save it in a variable. So let's create variable username and set it equal to $_post. And we want to check for a username. Let's copy paste it. Change the second one to password and the post method to password as well. And if we open our login.php, you can see that the name is equal to username and password. Now that we have assigned the post method username and password to a variable, we need to do some checks. And the first thing that we will be doing is to check if the user let one of the input fields open, because you need to have a username and password to log in. So let's create an if statement, and the condition is a function called empty, and we want to see if variable username is empty. And we don't want to create another if statement, so let's add 2 vertical bars, because we want to see that if username or password is empty. So let's create another empty function. And now we want to check for password. And just like I said in the previous episode, be aware that you can easily make mistakes with the parentheses. Because while empty has 2 parentheses, and the if statement has parentheses as well. And if it's empty, we want to copy our error message, paste it in the if statement. And let's say instead of access forbidden, empty fields. I actually don't think it's necessary to send back information in the URL because it's not a sign up form. But if you want to, you can actually add the username inside the header function as well. But I will just send them back with an error message. So let's create an else statement. Because while we don't want to do any other checks, we just want to connect to the database and see if the input fields that the user wrote down matches with the database information. And you might probably think that this is pretty difficult to do, but it actually isn't. So inside the else statement, let's run an SQL query, so variable SQL, set it equal to double quotes semicolon, and inside the double quotes, we want to select, so everything, so star, from the table users, where the username is equal to a question mark. And we're using a question mark because we're going to run another prepared statement. And now that we actually got our query, we want to initialize a new statement. So let's create a variable called stmt and set it equal to a function mysqli underscore stmt underscore init. And we want to initialize it by referring to the connection. And at the top of our page, we required our database connection, so we can use variable con right here. Let's go back to databases.php so I can show you what a variable con is. And that's the database connection that we created. What we want to do now is to run the SQL statement and check if it actually works in the database. And this will be done exactly the same way as the registers page, what we did right here, but I don't want to copy paste it. So let's create an if statement. And inside the condition, we want to check if it does not work with an exclamation mark. And what we want to check is function mysqli underscore stmt underscore prepare. Because we're going to prepare the statement by running the SQL string inside the database and check if the statement has an error inside of it or not. And if we get an error, there must be something wrong inside of your statement. So be aware that if something is going wrong, your select statement is probably wrong. So the MySQL statement prepare takes two params. And the first one is the statement, because that's what we want to check. And the second one is the variable SQL. What we want to do inside our if statement is send an error message because we're checking if it's not working. So let's copy paste a header and exit function. And let's return the user back to the index page, so the home page. And the error message is SQL error. Let's create an else statement, because what we want to do if the information matches is to grab the information from the database. So let's use a function called mysqli underscore stmt underscore bind underscore param, because we want to bind the information that the user gave us in the input fields with database information so we can see if there's a match. We need to add params, and the first one is the statement, so variable stmt. The second param is the kind of data that we want to send, and we want to send the username, so in double quotes s because it's a string. And the third param is the actual data that we want to send inside of the database. So in our case, it's variable username. Once again, be aware that your bind param must be equal to your statement. So you do not need to pass in a password right now, otherwise your password will be in the column of the username. Now that we have binded our params, let's go one line below and let's create a mysqli underscore stmt underscore execute. And we want to execute variable stmt. Now that we have executed the query, we want to grab the actual results and insert them into a new variable. So on the line below, let's create a variable called results and set it equal to a function called mysqli underscore stmt underscore get underscore results. And we want to get the results from the statement. So in our parentheses, let's add $stmt. We're hoping that we're getting back everything from the database using the select statement right here. But if we look at our code right now, we can risk not getting anything back from the database. So result can actually be equal to nothing. Let's actually change it to result, because we're getting one result back. The if statement right here will only check if a query can be performed, but it won't check if we're getting something back from the database. So we need to run another if statement to check if variable result is empty or not. So let's go right below result. Let's create an if statement. And we want to do two things. We want to check if we're actually getting back a result. And if we're getting back a result, we want to set the result equal to a variable. So let's create a new variable in our if statement condition called row and set it equal to mysqli underscore fetch underscore assoc. And what this function will do is it will fetch the data from variable result. Well, we actually need to pass in variable result. Excuse me. So what this function will do is it will fetch everything from variable result, and we're going to put it inside an associative array called row. And if we do not use fetch assoc, we will get raw data from the database, but we actually want to format it in an associative array so we can work with it. And if we're not getting anything back from the database, so let's create an else statement. Let's copy our header and exit function, because we want to send back an error message. And what we want to send back is no user, because a user is not found whenever this error message appears. So let's go right back inside of our if statement, where we are going to grab the password if we already have a person with the same username. And what I want to do then is to take the password from the database, hash it, and see if it matches with the actual variable password. So let's create a variable called passcheck and set it equal to password underscore verify. And this function will grab the password that the user has inputted, so password, which is also the first param, so let's add it, comma, and the second password is the password from the database. And since we actually created an associative array called row, we can write down variable row, brackets, single quotes, and I want the password. And be aware that passcheck will be a boolean because the system will see if it's a match or not. So we need to create another if statement below our passcheck. And inside the condition, we need to check if variable passcheck is equal to false. Because if it's equal to false, we don't want to allow the user to log in. So let's copy paste a header and exit function and change the error to wrong pass. Because whenever the pass check is false, it means that the password and the password from the database do not match. But if the password is a match, we want to run an else if statement. Since we're dealing with sensitive information, you want to prevent any kind of problem and just do another check. And inside our condition, we want to see if pass check is equal to true, equal to true. We actually need to create an else statement as well. And what we want to do in our else statement is basically the same as in the if statement, just to send them back with the same error message. But it's just an extra step security that I like to do. So let's go inside our else if statement, where we want to log in the user to the website. And in order to do this, we need to create a superglobal session, because the way a login system works is that the session has the information of a user whenever he signs in. And if a user signs in, we need to check if the superglobal session is available on the website or not. And remember, in our superglobal session video, I showed you how you could start a session by writing down session underscore start parentheses semicolon. Now we want to create session variables and set them equal to the information that we have. So on the line below, let's write down $_ session, set of brackets, and let's set it equal to a semicolon. And what we want to set it equal to is variable row, so the associative array. But we don't want to check for password, but we want to find the ID. And we want to call our session variable session ID. So let's copy paste it one more time, and let's change it to session user. And we want to check for the username. I don't want to save my password in the session because a password is sensitive information. So let's skip the password. Now that we actually created our session, we want to redirect the user to the home page. So let's copy a header and exit. Instead of sending an error, we want to send success. And the message is logged in. Right now, we created our session in our login-inc, but we need to create a session start on the index page as well because we cannot check if a session variable is available in the website. A session variable needs to be on every single page. And the way we can do that is to go to our header.php, and in our PHP opening and closing tags, we want to write down session_start because we're requiring our header on every single page. So every single page right now has a session. We also want to, give a message to the user whenever he is logged in. So let's go to our index.php because if it is successful, we're redirecting them to the index page. So let's remove home. Let's create opening and closing PHP tags. And let's create an if statement. And the condition is a check. So let's create an isSet function. And let's check for $_session, brackets, single quotes. And let's say that we want to check the session ID. And whenever a session ID is available, we want to echo out, you are logged in. And otherwise, so else, we want to echo out home. Before we test our login page, we need to go to our login.php, and the action needs to be equal to includes/login-inc.php. I actually forgot something. Let's go back to our login.php, and let's set the name of our button equal to submit as well. Save it, refresh it. Let's change the name to Dari100 and the password to 12345. Click on login, and we're getting an error message. I think I actually made a typo, so let's go back on line 22, and it's get result. So let's save it, refresh the browser, and you can see that success is equal to logged in, and we're getting the you are logged in message. Thank you for watching this episode, and this was actually the last one of this course. So if you have any questions or maybe you need more explanation about a certain topic, please send me a message because I will actually make a video for you. Don't forget to leave a review, and thank you for watching this course. This was it for this episode. If you do enjoy my content and you want to see more, leave this video a thumbs up, and if you're new to this channel, please hit that subscribe button.